Hi guys, and welcome to Chapter 8's second lecture, The Benefits of Biodiversity. Today we're going to primarily talk about the ecosystem services directly related to biodiversity, specifically how biodiversity is literally a supporting service, and what happens as we begin to lose biodiversity from an ecosystem and some of its cascading effects. Now, biodiversity is essentially the foundation for healthy ecosystems, and I want you to understand that biodiversity is a critical ecosystem supporting service. Without it, most ecosystems will ultimately fail and break down. And remember, all the way back in Chapter 1, that genetic diversity was literally listed as an ecosystem supporting service because ecosystem genetic diversity and, from at a larger perspective, ecosystem biodiversity is absolutely critical. And I actually want to go back to genetic diversity just for a second because it's a great segue into how biodiversity generally, when we scale up to that ecosystem perspective, how biodiversity acts as a stabilizing mechanism for ecosystems. Now, recall back to the previous lecture when we talked about how genetic diversity, and specifically increasing genetic diversity, made the chances that any one species will survive into the future far more likely. And that is because that if a species population has very high genetic diversity, what that means is that there's a very large diversity of traits and adaptations among individuals in that species. What that directly translates into is that there is a chance that for any one given disturbance that happens to that population of that species, there's going to be a higher chance that some of the individuals in that species are going to have the adaptations necessary to survive that disturbance. So with higher genetic diversity basically means that it stabilizes that population. It increases the likelihood or the probability that that species will survive any one given disturbance. Now, I want you to take that information and translate that into the ecosystem perspective now that we're scaling up. Biodiversity at the ecosystem level, so that's going to be more like species diversity, does the same thing for ecosystems that genetic diversity does for species. Whenever you have high species diversity, what you have is multiple organisms that are typically going to occupy the same niche. This is something known as functional redundancy. Remember that niches or niches, depending on however you want to pronounce it, are basically an organism or a species' job in that ecosystem. However, really biologically diverse communities often have multiple species with the same job or niche in that ecosystem. So it forms a functional redundancy. If you have high functional redundancy, if any one species goes extinct or gets kicked out of that ecosystem, you have other species that can still perform that vital job or that vital niche in that ecosystem. That's going to be really important because it allows that ecosystem to be stable. Even if one or two species go extinct, that ecosystem can still function because that job or that niche is still being provided by at least one other species. Now, the concepts of functional redundancy and ecosystem niches and species niches and how they all go together can be a little bit tough to understand at a first glance. So I like to use examples in order to help students understand some of these tougher concepts. And the best way I've ever heard the concepts of how functional redundancy and species diversity feed into the stability of an ecosystem is with the conceptual diagram of an ecological Jenga tower. So we're going to use the Jenga tower on the right-hand side of your screen as our example here. In our ecological Jenga tower, every block that you see over here is going to be a different species in that ecosystem. The Jenga tower itself is the actual ecosystem, and any given niche, again, an organism's job in that ecosystem, is going to be a level on that Jenga tower. Now, whenever an ecosystem has a lot of biodiversity and very high functional redundancy, it's like having 3 or 4 or 5 blocks per row, meaning that if you pull out any one block from that row, you're going to have other blocks that are going to be able to step up and support the weight of that Jenga tower. Very similarly, if you remove a species from an ecosystem with very high biodiversity, there are other species which can step in and continue to support that that niche. So your Jenga tower or your ecosystem doesn't collapse if you remove one block. However, if you continue to remove blocks from that same level, meaning that species providing the same niche go extinct, you begin to eventually erode that functional redundancy. Once you have done that, you lose stability in that ecosystem. So now, as we lose stability in the ecosystem, instead of having 4 or 5 blocks per level on our ecological Jenga tower, now we only have 1. There's only 1 species left to support that niche. So if we lose that species in our Jenga tower, the entire thing collapses. Anyone who's played Jenga will understand that you don't want to remove a block from a given level if it's the only block supporting the weight of that tower. It's a guaranteed way to make that tower fall. Well, similarly, if the only species supporting a niche goes extinct in an ecosystem, there's a very likely chance that that ecosystem will similarly collapse. So if you have high biodiversity, it's like having, again, a Jenga tower with a lot of blocks at every single level. But if you have very low diversity, it's like having only 1 or 2 blocks per level in your Jenga tower. And so this is essentially why having more diversity in any given ecosystem enhances that ecosystem's stability and keeps it nice and healthy. But unfortunately, not all species are created equal in terms of what niches they provide and the importance of any one given niche. And for this, I want you again to think back to Chapter 4 when we talked about Keystone species. Remember that Keystone species was any one species which disproportionately had a niche that impacted that ecosystem. Well, when we look at our Jenga tower, this would be the Jenga tower equivalent of having a species be the only block on that row. If you remove that one species from your Jenga tower, there is no functional redundancy there, period. That ecosystem is going to collapse. This is why Keystone species are so important. If you take them away, there is no chance that that ecosystem is going to remain healthy, and it will probably break down entirely. Now, in addition to Keystone species, another type of organism that I want you to become familiar with is an organism known as an ecosystem engineer. An ecosystem engineer is any organism or species which significantly alters or modifies and then maintains a habitat to facilitate very internal environmental conditions. So when we look at a habitat without an ecosystem engineer, there are a lot of environmental conditions which can vary. Because I'm a marine biologist, I'm going to use examples from the marine realm, right? So in a coastal ecosystem, for example, you could have a lot of variation in your wave energy. One day you might have a lot of wave action, another day it might be pretty calm. Or, for example, you might have variation in nutrients. One day you get a ton of nitrogen in the water, other days you might not get so much. So there's a lot of variation in environmental conditions in any given habitat. What ecosystem engineers do is they come in and they essentially stabilize all of that variation. So, for example, ecosystem engineers in the marine realm are going to be things like coral reefs, oyster reefs, seagrass meadows, mangrove swamps, anything that have these great physical structures. And what they do is any waves that go over the ecosystem engineer get broken down or slowed down. I don't know if you've ever seen coral reefs, but anytime you see coral reefs off an island, the coral reefs essentially protect that island by reducing all of the wave energy. So you see an environmental condition that could be pretty variable, and all of a sudden it is completely slowed down to where it is now constant and consistent. This has a lot of really important effects on the foundation of an ecosystem. When you have really consistent, constant internal conditions in a habitat, it allows any other organism that lives in that habitat to specialize very rapidly. All of a sudden, you don't have to worry about all of this environmental variability. Now it is purely a function of competition. And so now there's this ecological arms race that we talked about back in Chapter 4, where they're not even worried about adapting to different abiotic or environmental conditions because they're all constant anyway. Now they are specializing in this biotic realm, and they are now competing and predating or being prey on one another. So now you have these very specialized species that are very dependent on the very constant habitat conditions. So when we go back to the example of our ecological Jenga tower, an ecosystem engineer isn't one row in a given Jenga tower. An ecosystem ecosystem engineer is the table that Jenga tower is on. Without the table, the ecosystem wouldn't even be able to exist, and so no species in that ecosystem is now able to exist. By altering these constant conditions and in this environment, they literally engineer their own habitat. So without this engineer, that ecosystem wouldn't even be possible to exist. So in addition to keystone species, ecosystem engineers are extremely important, because without either one of them, you're going to have an ecosystem collapse. So examples of ecosystem engineers in terrestrial environments or above water environments are going to be elephants, ants, and beavers. I'm going to start with beavers first because they're probably the most easily understood ecosystem engineers in a terrestrial environment, because beavers very obviously alter habitat conditions. Beavers build a dam in the middle of a river which has flowing water, and when they build that dam, they immediately slow down water that is downstream of that river. So the physical structure that beavers provide is that dam. They create the dam, and as a result, water is dramatically slowed down. Sometimes beavers create entire lakes, so water is so slowed down that it's actually more or less static. This is the physical environment that beavers create, and as a result, all other organisms in that ecosystem can adapt to those constant conditions. But there are other organisms in the terrestrial environment that also provide the role of being an ecosystem engineer. A great example is an elephant. Inadvertently, just from being around, elephants crush and flatten earth, and as a result, they crush and flatten plants. So they create an environment where slow-growing plants really can't exist. If a plant is slow-growing, there's a really high chance that before that plant can actually disperse its seeds, that elephant is going to crush and flatten them. So, because the elephant is present, only really fast weedy species or grassy species can grow, because they're the only ones that can probably survive being crushed, and they're the only ones that grow fast enough to continue to disperse their seed. Here, I'm actually going to contradict myself for a second, because elephants are actually the exception when it comes to ecosystem engineers. While most ecosystem engineers, again, create those very constant internal conditions, they stabilize environmental variation, elephants actually do the opposite, because they are actually removing physical structures from that environment. By crushing any large growing or woody plant, elephants actually facilitate increased environmental variation. No longer are there going to be those large woody plants that can sort of buffer wind energy or promote constant shade. Now it's only going to be a grassland. So elephants are still considered an ecosystem engineer because they are facilitating their own environment. They're just doing it in the exact opposite way. So now they are facilitating more environmental variation, whereas most ecosystem engineers create very constant internal conditions which have less environmental variation. Lastly, you have ants, which is probably the most indirect way of being an ecosystem engineer. Ants build their own ecosystem by dispersing seeds and promoting plant growth. Now, ants alone aren't the ones creating their own physical structures, but the plants that they grow are the ones providing the physical structures. Ants use the seeds to eat, but ants can be pretty clumsy, and from time and time again, they can drop their seeds in any random place. By doing that, they rapidly disperse the seeds all over the areas where they've settled, and they rapidly promote plant growth in that area. So areas where you have ants are probably going to be areas which have really large, hardy vegetation, just because ants are inadvertently acting as farmers and accidentally planting seeds all over the place. This creates an entirely new environment which wouldn't be able to exist without that rapid seed dispersal. So these are some of the ways that ecosystem engineers can exist in the terrestrial environment. Now, similarly to terrestrial organisms, ecosystem engineers in the marine environment also modify environmental conditions around them by building large physical structures. When you have a physical structure in water, what that does is it usually slows down wave energy and current flow. Waves crash on top of the now much shallower coastal shelf, and current is slowed down because it literally is running into an obstacle. So it's slowed down very similarly to how water is slowed down when you have a beaver dam. But in the marine environment, a lot of cool stuff happens when you slow water down. When you slow water down, a lot of the particles that the water is carrying now lose energy and and begin to fall out of suspension. If those particles contain nutrients, you then get a very consistent supply of nutrients in addition to just slowing your water down and reducing wave energy. When you have lots of consistent nutrients, then a lot of plants and primary producers can then grow and thrive in that environment. In addition, when you have large physical structures with a lot of little complex parts and nooks and crannies, you now have habitat and refuge for fish and other organisms. So, in addition to providing a stable food source through primary producers, other organisms also have a place to hide so the predators don't eat them. So, you're going to have two basic types of ecosystem engineers in the marine environment. On one hand, you're going to have reef-building animals, which provide physical structure, and on the other hand, you're going to have several types of plants which are so massive or grow in such large extents that they facilitate their own habitat just by existing. Examples of reef-building organisms or reef-building animals are going to be your coral reef, your oyster reef, and your sponge reefs. Now, coral reefs and oyster reefs create their own reef-like structures by building calcium carbonate shells and stacking on top of one another, which then becomes a very hard substrate, almost like living rock, which provides that physical structure necessary to buffer environmental variation. In addition, similarly, sponges can grow very massive, and they normally have silica skeletons, and that provides a rigid structure which can then slow down wave energy, provide habitat for organisms, and do all of the ecosystem engineering things that we just talked about. Now, aside from animals, we also have plants which also serve as ecosystem engineers in the marine environment. Things like mangrove swamps have roots which are very hardy and very hard, and it slows down wave energy and has a lot of nooks and crannies for organisms to hide in. Similarly, seagrass meadows and algae, specifically kelp, can also provide that kind of habitat which can do the same kinds of things. Kelp can grow for hundreds of feet tall and be very, very thick, and as a result, it similarly can slow down wave energy. And seagrass meadows, which don't grow that tall but also often exist in very shallow environments, also provide the same thing. They can slow down that wave energy in that current, and they can provide a nursery for all of these different kinds of organisms to hide in and get food out of. So ecosystem engineers are equally important in the marine environment as they are in the terrestrial environment. And now that we've talked a little bit about how important ecosystem engineers are, unfortunately now we have to talk about their decline. Now I'm going to speak specifically about the marine environment because that's what I've been trained in and that's what I'm most comfortable talking about, but the picture is pretty bleak. We've lost around 85% of our oyster reefs around the globe, which is enormous, and we've lost about 50% of our coral reefs and 50% of our seagrass meadows. Again, without these ecosystem engineers altering the habitat, a lot of very productive and very biologically diverse ecosystems wouldn't even be able to exist. So when we lose these engineering capabilities through the loss of our ecosystem engineers, we often see a very dramatic loss in biodiversity. And a great example of what happens when you lose an ecosystem engineer is going to be on the right-hand side of your screen down here, where you see a before and after picture of what happens when a coral reef has been completely degraded and lost. When you lose the coral reef, you lose the habitat that every other organism in that ecosystem is dependent on. So the collapse of that ecosystem engineer results in the collapse of the entire ecosystem. And now you've heard me drone on about ecosystem engineers and biodiversity and Jenga towers for like 20 minutes now, and you might be thinking, well, yeah, but why is this important? Why is it important that we keep these ecosystems healthy? Why is it important that we keep these ecosystem engineers? And that's because this directly impacts you and me. Remember that when we lose healthy ecosystems, we lose the ecosystem services that they provide. In the example of seagrass meadows and coral reefs and oyster reefs, we lose food. And so food security is one of the primary resources that is impacted when we lose ecosystems and the services they provide. For the example of, again, coral reefs and oyster reefs and seagrass meadows, these are all nursery habitats. Oysters, it's very directly. When we lose oyster reefs, we lose oysters we like to eat. For seagrass meadows, about 90% of the fish that you like to eat start life in a seagrass meadow. So when we lose the seagrass meadow, we lose all of those fish that we like to eat. And then coral reefs, reefs, in addition to providing tourism money through a cultural ecosystem service, they are also home to a dramatic amount of productivity and a lot of fish that folks that live near them like to eat. So when we lose these ecosystems, we lose ecosystem services, and it directly impacts you and me. But in the terrestrial environment, food security is impacted through biodiversity in an entirely different way. Humans used to eat around 7,000 plant species over the entire history or the entirety of our existence. However, more recently, with the industrialization and intensification of agriculture, we have drastically narrowed the number of plants and the number of animals in our diet. Now, around 90% of the food that we eat comes from 15 species of plants and 8 species of animals. And a lot of different vegetables that you like to eat actually come from the same plant species. Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, cabbage, broccoli, all of these actually come from the wild cabbage plant. So even though you might think you're eating different foods, they actually come from the same species of plants. And this is really important because very similar to ecosystem diversity, biodiversity in our agricultural systems are really important. A lack of redundancy in our agricultural systems leaves us vulnerable to disturbances. And disturbances basically equate to crop failures. For example, if a disease wipes out one or more of those 15 crops that we like to eat, we don't have the redundancy of relying on other crops to fill that role in our diet. So by maintaining wild biodiversity, we can exploit the variation of adaptations and genes in wild versions of the crops that we've domesticated in order to maintain that stability in our diet. So relying on the biodiversity of wild plants is actually really important when we talk about farming and agriculture. In addition to food security, drugs, medicines, and cosmetics are often derived from natural plants and animal species. Many medicines, for example, have been found from nature, and today around half of all of the pharmaceuticals in the world are derived directly from chemical compounds that are found in plants. This generates an enormous amount of money, around $150 billion in sales each year, and saving thousands, if not millions of lives directly from these benefits of biodiversity. And we still haven't discovered all of the world's species yet, especially in very biologically diverse areas such as tropical rainforests. We might not know about some plant with a life-saving cure. So by promoting biodiversity in biodiversity hotspots, areas that have very biologically productive systems like tropical rainforests, we are basically keeping those undiscovered species around so that we might discover them and derive additional benefits such as life-saving medicines. And again, this all goes back to the ecosystem services that we talked about back in chapter 1. And here we've only talked about food security and medicine. Both of those are going to run into the provisional ecosystem services, the ecosystem providing something for us. But there are also regulating services and cultural services that these ecosystems provide for us. Now, supporting services are actually what the ecosystems are. So biodiversity is actually a supporting service that maintains all of these other services for us. But provisional, regulating, and cultural services are all integral in how we operate in human society. Without the benefits of biodiversity, we lose all of these ecosystem services that we've relied on, and we have to figure out ways to manufacture it on our own. That can sometimes be really expensive, or other times it can outright be impossible. So I want to leave you with this little graphic over here on the right-hand side of your screen, where you see a lot of the benefits of biodiversity coming in the form of these different ecosystem services. And in addition to all of the benefits of biodiversity that humans receive from ecosystems just existing, we also have a few ethical and moral questions we need to ask when we talk about species extinction, and specifically humans driving species extinction. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about species extinctions and loss of biodiversity around the globe. But before we get there, I want you to ask yourself a few questions. Aside from all the benefits of biodiversity, what obligation do we have from safeguarding species from extinction? Do species inherently have the right to exist, or is it something that we can justify based on whether it's convenient for us or not? Is it fair to drive a species to extinction just for more resources or to make more space for us? In other words, is it fair to wipe a species off the planet just so we can continue this very wasteful way of life? And these are some of the ethical questions we really have to answer when we talk about biodiversity biodiversity loss and a species extinction due to humans wiping them off the planet? I'm going to leave you with these questions, and we're going to readdress them when we talk about loss of biodiversity in the next lecture. Now, this is everything I have for you today, and I'll see you guys next for, again, the loss of biodiversity that we're going to talk about in the following lecture.